Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raj Oza and I'm Twisha Khokhani and we're going to be talking about his book Double Play on the Red Line. And yeah, let's just get started. So, could you first just give a little brief overview of the book?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the book, it has several layers to it. Some folks will say, "Oh, it's a Chicago book," and it is that. It's very much about Chicago, and it's about the world beyond. Others will say, "Oh, this is about race and caste," and it is that. There's hierarchies at play, and there's race. Others will say, "Oh, it's a baseball book." Well, it's that too. There's elements of sports and yeah, there's, hints of cricket as well. At the heart of it, this book was inspired, this novel, it's a work of fiction, was inspired by my daughter's work with the Innocence Project at Northwestern University. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Innocence Project, the premise is that many, many people in America, almost always men, more often than not, black men, are wrongfully convicted. And the professor there, David Protas, had a hypothesis that he could bring a group of students who are investigative journalists together and they could investigate cases. And they'd say, oh, let's find out if this person was truly guilty. And sometimes they'd find out, yep, the person was guilty. Or are they actually innocent? So Anu, my daughter, was in a small cohort, 4 or 5 students, that set out to prove one or the other, innocence or guilt. And they proved that the gentleman whose case they had was truly innocent. And I thought I'd write a book of nonfiction because I'd written 3 nonfiction books before. And I couldn't find my way there, mostly because it wasn't my story to tell. It was my daughter, Anu, is her story to tell. And there's the gentleman who was wrongfully convicted. And, was told that, oh, we can free you, but we can't exonerate you, which means you're not really free, which is the second to last theme that the book gets around. What is freedom? What does freedom mean? And then the last theme is this fancy word from the German doppelgangers. We all have alternate selves. For those of us who are of Indian origin, well, what if we hadn't or our ancestors hadn't left India? Who would we be, right? For those of us that said, oh, we were going to study this, but we ended up studying that. Well, who would we have been if we had studied that? So the character in this novel, Ernie, could have been one of the greatest baseball players ever. A black man who played in the Negro Leagues. He would have been the first Chicago Cubs ball player to have been up from the Negro Leagues, the first black ball player for the Cubs. But on the night, before he was to play at iconic Wrigley Field, he is found to be in a situation where a man dies. And the rest of the book is sussing out, well, is there guilt here? How do we actually recognize what is freedom? And it's 2 people, an Indian American professor of journalism, Ruthan, and Ernie, starting to befriend each other and figure out, what actually happened on that fateful night in 1953. And for those of us as readers, we all think to ourselves, well, could that happen to me? Could I be wrongfully convicted? And the truth is that happens all the time. In Minnesota recently, doesn't matter what one's politics are, but a woman was shot. There but for the grace of God go I, right? This alternate reality. So there's a lot of layers to the book, and thank you for asking, Twisha. I might have gone a little longer than we bargained for, but that gives you and our audience a sense of the book.
Yeah, of course. And I'm seeing all the themes that you're pointing out in the book as I was reading it. And one thing that I know from you is that this is sort of kind of like an autobiography. And there are both like elements of fiction and nonfiction. So could you tell us what parts of this book were nonfiction, what parts were fiction, and how has your story been told through this book?
It's a great question. So, the fancy word in literary circles is some people would call this autofiction. And I was at a reading, a few months ago, and Kiran Desai, who is a tremendous novelist, has a book out. And I asked a question. I said, how much, it's kind of the same question that you said, you know, how much of this is autobiographical? And she had a great response, which I'll use here. Isn't all fiction autobiographical? And I extend that and say, isn't all writing autobiographical? So, in some ways, everything in this book is about me. It's my worldview, it's how I think about things, etc. And then there are a couple of incidents which are truly autobiographical, as in they actually happened to me. So, when a cop pulled me over in my senior year of college, so I was in the Midwest, happened to be at the same university where this book is set. So I guess that's also autobiographical. Um, and I'd grown a really long beard. A friend of mine had died, and to honor him, I just let the beard grow out. And I was living in Chicago at the time, and I hear this person shout out, "Hey, boy." Like, huh, couldn't be talking to me because that's language back, I don't know today as well, but certainly back then in Chicago, 1980, when a person said, "Hey, boy," inevitably it was from a white person to a black man. And it could have been a younger black person, a white person to an older black man. It's a form of disrespect. Well, I've never been called "Hey, boy." So I just kept walking. And then I hear it again. "Hey, boy, I'm talking to you." And then I look and it's a cop car. I said, "Huh?" And he says, "Don't huh me." And all of that is in the novel. I mean, literally what happened to me, I decide to play that out for Ratan, that it happens to him. And it's what has created in me an empathy for all people. And I hoped to convey that empathy through Ratan, to say he understands what Ernie has gone through. He's not a black man. He's not a baseball player. He is a professor. He's a privileged human being. And he understands because this happened to him. And this is kind of connected to the Minnesota case, that we're talking about, that these things actually do happen to us.
I completely agree. And with that, I know Ratan could see his point of view, but I saw a moment in the book where he was a little bit racist, and it was that moment where he confessed to Ernie, like, "Oh yes, I mean, my family would block our cars and be specifically wary around black communities and neighborhoods." And I think that's interesting, the fact that you so honestly portrayed him as flawed, and he's not perfect. And is this a reflection of something that happened in your life? Was this purposeful?
Yeah, the human condition. What is the human condition? And it is to be flawed. We're not saints. I'm a Gandhian, and Gandhiji would be the first to say, "Hey, look, I'm no saint. I have my flaws," right? So every one of us do. And I think honest writing, especially in terms of fiction, which is like a funny word, fiction, honest, it's the most truthful writing you can have, um, will call out the flaws of a character, will not elevate him into some kind of a saint. So I really tried with that scene to say, "Hey, look, he is flawed, and he is open to understanding what his flaws are." Um, as for racism, you know, this is one of those challenging things. I think people often feel like, well, we elected Mr. Obama as president. We're colorblind now in the US. That's just bunk. Racism has existed, exists today, will probably always exist. And the same is true in India, right? We are not above this. We have this in us. The key is to look in the mirror and confront that reality and then find out, well, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And speaking of like the nature of humans, there's this moment in the book when Ratan realizes maybe hierarchies are embedded in us, like some kind of cancer's unfeeling twisted double helix. Do you think that this hierarchical thinking is inherent to human nature or is it socially constructed?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading it so closely that you can call out a specific line. It's every writer's dream to have a caring reader that, some line or lines resonated with them. It's an important line to me. Um, so when I was an undergraduate, I studied anthropology as well as biomedical engineering and a bunch of other things. And I read a book by this author, a French anthropologist, Louis Dumont, and he titled it Homo Hierarchicus. Man is hierarchical. And that really informed me to say, is this really the case or not? And I do believe that hierarchies are built into all animals, and humans are just animals. So we have that in us, right? If you think in terms of, the Hindu caste system, you know, Brahmins on, quote unquote, down, there are hierarchies built. Then you say, well, yeah, that's just India. We in America, we're flat. We don't have hierarchies. And I said, well, just kind of think about, students your age. And they said, well, I want to go to this college, not that college. They're like, huh, what's that all about? And just the fact of going to college versus stopping at high school or joining the military, these are all honorable things to do, right? To become a plumber. But hierarchically speaking, somebody that goes to this college and gets this degree and gets this profession versus somebody who finishes high school or doesn't even finish high school and starts a plumbing business, there are hierarchies built into that. Now, it's interesting things get subverted, right? Somebody is a plumber and runs this amazing plumbing business and makes millions of dollars doing that. Well, all of a sudden in America, where capitalism is core, they kind of rise in terms of the hierarchy. So I do believe the sense of hierarchies are there. And again, it's that same question. What do we do about that? When we look in the mirror and say, okay, I recognize that I have these hierarchical things. I recognize they can be cancers. Um, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah. So could you tell us more about how this happened in the book? So you talked about how Ratan's wife had that struggle with the caste parallel. You were talking about with the Brahmin and the Adivasi. How does that parallel Ernie's experience in America?
Yeah, yeah. So, and I'm glad that were sensitive enough that it's not just about caste in terms of how we often think of it, Brahmins and Dalits, right? Often we're set, the dialectic is set against those two. And it's like, well, where do tribals fall in? So Mandara, Ratan's wife, is the child of a Brahmin and a tribal. And for those who don't know what a tribal is, the native Indians, the folks who were there first, the original people. Um, Adivasis is the right phrase to use as well. And so I wanted to complicate it, that she wrestled with that. And she asked, who am I? What am I? And the other wrestling that she does, because she's dark skinned, because colorism is rampant in India, is she wrestles with that. And there are hierarchies of that. The fairer you are, the further up the hierarchy. The darker you are, the further down you are. Um, and is this fair? Is it just? Of course it isn't. But again, what do we do about this unfairness, this injustice? And yeah, like we said at the top of the conversation, this book is about social justice. What are we going to do about these things?
Wonderful. Yeah, that was very well said. Just to shift gears a little bit, this book it has a lot of baseball terminology, a little bit of cricket terminology. I noticed like there's a lot of things. There's a lot of baseball references that I actually searched up, like the single, double, triple, and there were also like the chapters were named after trains. So what's the significance of that, and how would you advise the author to go about reading this book if they're completely new to how baseball in Chicago is laid out?
So, a little bit of a worldview as a reader. I think we read to enter other worlds. That's what makes us an empathetic human beings, to enter another human's life, another space in the world. So let's start back, backwards from Chicago. If you've never been to Chicago and you've never been on the L, and when I say L, it's like, what does that even mean? The elevated train system. Well, if you're interested in finding out other parts of the world, well, enter into a book like this. Not the only book, certainly, but you can explore. And it's the same about being a non-sports fan. Um, so you don't need to be a sports fan. As a matter of fact, my favorite readers are the ones who say, I know nothing about baseball or I even dislike baseball, but I love this book because I just use what I know and what I care about. I happen to really love baseball and I love Chicago. So I wrote what I really knew about and I used the metaphors and I tried to make them accessible. Even if one doesn't know what a single is, a double is, a triple is, you can pretty much say, oh, I can imagine that the first part of the book, it's a three-part book, would be a single. That makes sense. A double, a triple. Even if you don't know that, in baseball there are, nine, position players, and then they bat, first to ninth, and now there's an extra player called a designated hitter. Never mind the details. You can say, oh, I can see how this is structured. And even if you've never been on the L, you can say, oh, I can see how these characters are meeting each other and connecting on the red line of the elevated train in Chicago across these various stops where these people are. Now, if you happen to love baseball, you happen to love Chicago, if you happen to have ridden the L, you're going to have a deeper appreciation of it. But it's the same if you read a book about India and you've never been to India. Obviously, if you've been to India, you were just where in Gujarat? Where were you recently?
Gujarat and Mumbai, yeah.
Right? And if you've never, let's say you've never been to India, or if you're Indian, but you're from Bengal or from Madras, Chennai, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can learn about Gujarat. I can learn about, Bombay, Mumbai. It's like, wow, it's the same here, that it's possible to access it if I've done a half decent job making it accessible. And I'll turn it back on you. I mean, did the red line? I want to go back to the red line in a second. Did it get in the way or did it enhance it, even if you missed the nuances?
I I don't think it got in the way. I think it caused me to do a little bit more research.
Yes.
Because on that first read, I'm usually not like trying to pay attention to small details. I'm usually just trying to understand the gist of the book. So I think some of them went over my head. And when I went back and, actually researched a little bit, it started to make a little bit more sense to me. So I think I would advise readers to, really pay close attention to detail because there's actually not, aside from the baseball metaphors and everything, there's a lot of things in this book that I think require a lot of close reading and the book can truly be understood more if you're really reading closely.
That's really fair. And I believe that's true of any good literature, that it works on so many different levels. And the deeper you immerse yourself into it, and now we're so lucky. I mean, you don't have to go to the library, you just hop on Google and there it is, right? AI can tell you so much. But let me tell you about the red line. So even the core Chicagoan who rides the L every day and on the red line, they may not know about this little bylaw of real estate called redlining. Redlining is a way of segregating people. A black person cannot be in this neighborhood. And it existed when I grew up in Chicago. It is there still, informally perhaps, but it's still there. So I'm playing with this nuance of this red line. I could have chosen any line. There's so many lines in Chicago, the blue line, the pink line, the orange line. I purposely chose the red line. Now I happen to know the red line better than most of the other lines, but that wasn't the only reason. The Cubs ballpark happens to be on the red line. These are all nice conveniences, but there's also this element of, oh, we do box people. We do tell people you can stay there, but you can't be here. And redlining is an important part of thinking about, how is it that people are free to be where they want to be? You remember the scene where, Ernie says, boy, if I could just run without people thinking, yeah, I committed some crime or, that I don't belong here by the lake or something, I'd feel like a free guy, right? Well, that's related to redlining without being overt about it.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. And so Ernie and Ratan, they have this friendship that's, it develops slowly, and there's a lot of tests to the friendship, like when Ratan broke his trust, reading the letters unopened. So what do you see there as their turning point in their relationship?
Mm. Yeah, so I do think male friendships, and may be true for female too, but I do believe male friendships are slow to develop. So I think that's just kind of out there in the world. I do think that Ernie has been burned so often that he's wondering, what's your motivation? And Ruther's motivation was not pure in the beginning, right? He's a first year professor. He's an assistant professor. He wants to get tenure. He thinks by telling Ernie's story, that'll help him get tenure. It's kind of transactional. He's doing it for himself. So there's a lot of reason for Ernie to say, I'm not sure I'm interested, right? The turning point, and I was looking for how do I do this? How do I do this? Was when Mandara says to Ratan, share my diary with him, share my experiences around caste and hierarchy and what does it mean to be free and all that. And I think when you're vulnerable, people will reciprocate vulnerability and friendship can deepen based on that. So that was really the turning point of when he shares that. And Ernie's like, wow, this is something, for you to share something so intimate as your wife's diary, that's pretty special. So yeah, there was an actual turn and yeah, you can almost see the novel pivot because the relationship pivots at that point.
Awesome. And I really adore the relationship between Ratan and his wife. I'm sure it's quite reflective of yours. And I'm wondering in this book, how much did it influence you in the making of this book? Why did you choose to include so much of it into the book?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting if Mangla, my wife, was here, she'd say, people are all going to think this is about us. And it is and it isn't because it's about relationships and it's about love and it's about marriage and all that type of stuff. And yes, I go for the cheap connection. My name starts with R, Raj, and so does, Ratan's and Mangla's name starts with an M and so does Mandara's, so that's kind of at a very surface level. Um, the deeper level was Mangla and I were actually immediately after marriage separated for 13 months. So it's an actual truth. And I knew what that felt like to have an immigration system say, well, your marriage doesn't warrant you two being together right away. And it's just like, what pain inside of that. And I think the memory of that, and I literally went through all of our letters because back in the 80s, that's what people did. They wrote letters to each other. They didn't email to each other because it didn't exist. They hardly called each other because we didn't have WhatsApp and free phone calls. A phone call of 30 minutes would cost me my entire month of rent, which was kind of reflected in the novel.
Yeah, I remember that.
So probably the pain of separation, the pain of longing, um, is reflective of my lived reality. And I use that to reflect on the pain of loss that Ernie faces. When he goes to prison, he loses the love of his life. Now he happens to lose Lucille forever. But how do we empathize with people when that happens? When he goes to prison, he also loses his mother. His father had already died in the Korean War. He loses his mother. What does it mean to be alone? And for 13 months, the author, lived alone. He has a deep loneliness. Um, and I think it is meant to be that empathetic sense of how can we make Ratan be empathetic towards another man's situation that he can't really share. Never been imprisoned, never certainly wrongfully convicted, right? All this stuff. But he's had loss and he has longing. So, yeah.
I like that. That's really beautiful. I think it's really important in stories that kind of you don't really relate to, but it's important to like really good literature will always have that component of having something in there that makes it connect to you.
Hmm.
And that's what I really appreciate about this book.
Uh,
So another thing is that in this book there are real people that actually were there in the 80s, no? So have you talked to them? How do you think they view this book? Or what is the situation around these real people and implementing them into this book?
yeah, top of mind, three real people come to mind right now. They're all dead. Um, so, I chose to not use anyone who was alive and living because I thought that would not be fair in any way. Because it's like, well, it's a real human being, you know, renamed sometimes and sometimes not renamed. Um, in general, I tried to be really generous towards the real person. Um, the primary real person is the baseball announcer Jack Brickhouse.
Yeah.
I grew up listening to him. I just admired him so much, and I wanted to bring him alive in this way. And I thought he was a really decent person. I'm sure he was flawed in his own way because we all are. But is like, if there is one character who doesn't seem to have too many flaws, if any, it was Jack. So that's what I did with it. Now, this is something that you may or may not have been able to notice. Very few people are able to catch this, but every one of my characters who were in the courtroom back in 1953, their first name is derived from the first name of somebody on the baseball Cubs of 1969. So Donna is actually derived from Don Kessinger, who bats first. Glenn is Glenn. It goes all the way through like this. Um, so these are real people, but I don't really talk about the real person. I just borrowed their first name and then played with it. Sometimes, I mean, they're all men back in the 69, but two of those people are actually women, in terms of the book. So it's kind of fun to do that. But it is this other part of the doppelganger that every one of these real people, as well as the characters, could have had another life. And that's something I try to get at as well.
Judge Ferguson. He was possibly the most complex character. What inspired his character? And he's a lot of good, he's also a lot of bad. So yeah, just tell me about how did you write this character?
Yeah, and we can't give away the plot line because I think it'll disappoint people if we do that, in terms of, well, what happens with the guy batting ninth, with the good judge. Um, he's meant to be a metaphor for the American justice system, a highly flawed system. And boy, when it works really well. But when it has these personal ambitions in them, it can be incredibly cruel and tragic. And that cruelty and tragedy is what happened to Ernie because of Judge Ferguson. Um, so that's the serious part. Now we'll say, well, why'd you decide with Judge Ferguson? As it turns out, the remember I said each one of the major characters in the courtroom was derived from a baseball player in 1969 who played for the Cubs. So there was a ball player for the Cubs. His name was Fergie Ferguson Jenkins. So as it turns out, we lived next to Fergie. We actually, my family lived next to Fergie in Canada. And he was this, tall man and kind of intimidating and this and that. And then we moved to Chicago and we find out he's this amazing ball player for the Cubs. So he's like, all this stuff is in my head of what to do with the complexity of you think of a person this way and then they're like this, but then they're like this. And can they be honest with that reconciliation, that reckoning of what happened and why did I do this? And that's what the final chapter is all about. It is a reckoning of why did he do what he did and what did that mean? Um, Now, just the last part. So baseball has this thing called spring training before the baseball season actually begins. last year around this time, I was planning on going with my son and son-in-law to Arizona to watch some baseball games before the actual season started. Well, I actually see Fergie Jenkins there. Um, and I don't want to bother the man, but my son and son-in-law said, "Oh, just say hello to him." So I went and said hello, and he said, "Yeah, yeah, a couple minutes." Well, like 15, 20 minutes later, we're talking about all this stuff. And he asked me, because I tell him, "Well, you're a judge in the novel." He goes, "So am I a good guy or a bad guy?" I said, "It's not you who's the judge. There's a judge named Judge Ferguson." He goes, "Okay, but is the judge a good guy or a bad guy?" I said, "Well, he's human. There are things that make him just a wonderful human being, and there are things that make him flawed." He goes, "Fair enough. I'll say he's a good guy."
That's really interesting, how you're bringing all of these life experiences into one novel. And you've actually met some of these people that are inspiring the characters in the story. I think that's all the questions I have. This was a wonderful book to read. It was definitely a wild roller coaster. So thank you so much for your time.
You've made my day.